So last week we introduced poetry, and last week we introduced writing about poetry, and this week we're going to add another piece to that to fold in. If we were writing, how could we include research about a poem and a poet? Down in our library, we have a resource called Poetry for Students. It is a multi-volume reference book. So if you picture walking into the library, on the right-hand side of the library is the reference section. All of the big, huge books like the encyclopedias that you cannot check out. They are all intended for students to use for research. One of those materials we have over there, Poetry for Students, indexes different poems by different poets and talks about what does the poem mean, how is that meaning built. It has information about the poet, their work as a whole, and then also has academic critical writing about their poem. So if you were going to do, let's say, a research paper where you had to talk about, hey, who's this poet and what does their work look like, this would be a great resource that you could use. We're going to be working with this week to help with how do we fold in this research part. I've made copies of the actual book here for you. Now, if you take a look, this first page that you see is the title page. So this is not the cover of the book. This is once we open it, it's one of the first pages that's there. When you flip and you look at the second page is what's called the publication page. Lots of teeny tiny little writing that's there that includes things like the copyright date, which is when the book was actually published, as well as other referencing materials. Once you look at page 3 is the beginning of this entry. It is not the beginning of the book necessarily. It is the beginning of the entry that we are going to be looking at. And so you notice at the top, it has the name of the poem. It also has the poet who wrote that poem. It's how they index entries in this source material. And then it kind of goes from there. We will be kind of filling out that page, to that worksheet today. I hate to use that word, but that's what it is. So that you can become familiar with, hey, if you had a book like this in front of you, what do you do with it? Let me tell you why I have this assignment to help get you used to how to do this. One year, I went to the library with students to do research, and I had a student walk up to me with the book in their hand, out like this. And they walked straight up to me and dead serious, looked me in the eye and said, how do I use this? And I laughed them in the face and walked away. I don't want you to be in that situation of not knowing how to use a book resource. Really, seriously, he did. And I laughed at him. And then I went back and I said, okay, let's look at this. So we're going to work our way down here. Let's start at the very top. When we look at this entry, let's say, hey, you're going to do research over Edgar Allan Poe. And you pull up this entry that talks about Annabel Lee. You notice that the first section is an introduction to the article. And then in black is that bar that says author biography. The first thing we want to do is to get used to how do we read a reference material and take notes over it. So if you notice, this first section literally has it broken down for some of the things that this entry has within it. And so I'm going to give you some time to literally read this biography and take notes over it. We're going to come back together and share some of what we see, but just as a starting place, that's what we're going to do. So read the biography, take some notes over it. We'll come back together in a few minutes. You know what time school starts, right? Okay. So we're just looking at the biography. You don't have to worry about going any further than that. Just take some basic notes. They don't have to be lengthy and exhaustive. Just what are some of the high points about Pope? Take 2 minutes. We'll come back together in 2 minutes to move on to the next step. Okay. So this just gets you into that habit of, okay, I've got this in front of me. How do we take notes over a source? Because very regularly, when we start this process of research, students don't even know how to break the text down into taking notes and looking at what's present. Because ultimately, what we are looking to do is not just learn about the subject, but then incorporate what you have learned into your writing. That is the purpose of research. Our next step would move to the next part of the text. After the biography, you notice that the poem is present. In Poetry for Students, they index each entry by poem. So it's not necessarily by poet. So for example, we are looking at the entry for Annabelle Lee. Edgar Allan Poe has many poems in this series. So the biography may be the same in each entry, but the information about each poem is going to be different. So this next step has you read the poem, and we're not going to worry about annotating. You do not have to annotate. But what I want you to do is notice that, we didn't copy all that. That's okay. So if we take a look, take a moment to read the poem silently to yourself before we move on to the next step, which is going to start to look at, okay, how do we make the turn in terms of research? So looking at the poem, you notice that like a lot of Poe's work, it does focus on a lost love, and here specifically one that is dead. It has a very dark tone to it. Of course, by the end of it, if you didn't notice, he's sleeping in the tomb with his presumed love. Now, if you're looking at this and you're like, I was supposed to get all this out of it? One thing this source does, if you look here on the next page, we didn't copy the entire thing for you, but it will move in and then go, hey, here is a breakdown by section of what this poem is saying. And so it really helps to move you through not just the comprehensive part of it, but also how does he build meaning and how does he approach it? As the source goes on, if you just flip pages with me, you notice once it gives you the idea of, hey, here's what the poem means. The next section will talk about major themes the poem touches on. It then talks a bit about the style of the poem before getting into the historical context, and then it would eventually get into larger meanings. How is it talked about? This is important because as we move in later this week, you will be choosing a poem from a list of 6. You will have an article that looks like this, and you will be responsible not just for reading it, but for taking notes over it and eventually incorporating a quote from your research into that source. But we need to talk about how do we actually move beyond this research bit. So we practice note taking. Once you've gone through the whole article and you've taken notes, we've got to look at, okay, well, what's your next step? At the bottom of that first page, you notice that it talks about creating a citation for your stuff. When we talk about research, we also talk about citations and how to show where your work comes from. That is the purpose of research. Research is meant to show not just what you've learned, but where it came from. In the English world and the liberal arts world, we follow a model known as MLA. It formats how we put together citations and how we give credit for the research that we've found. MLA stands for Modern Language Association. They put out a guide that says, here is how you cite these books when you find them. We're going to practice that by hand. There are much easier ways that we can do this by computer. I will show you those as we get to them. But we're going to start by practicing by hand so that you can see where you find all the information that you need. On this sheet, it gives you here in bigger text all the parts we need to find here in this packet. You notice that the first thing it asks for is the author. When we are talking about author, we are looking at the person that wrote the entry you're reading. Well, if you take a look, here's the first page. Is there an author listed who wrote this entry in this research book? So you're telling me Edgar Allan Poe wrote his own entry in this research book that was published in what year? 2000? No, he didn't. He's the guy who wrote the poem that the research is based on. But do they list anybody as credited author for the research materials that are present here? No. Poetry for Students does not give credit for individual entries. And so we don't need to worry about that. That means the first thing that we're going to list here is the title of the article or the entry. So here on this first page, what is the entry title we're looking at? Annabel Lee. This book indexes entries by the title of the poem. So the first thing we're going to fill out to do this entry, in quotation marks with correct capitalization, is the name of the article. So we're looking here at number 3, where it says, hey, put your citation at the end. We're going to do this together. So start by typing Annabel Lee in quotations, and then you notice that there is a period here. All of the punctuation that you see here needs to be replicated as we write this. It is all formatted. It is all definite. It is all part of doing it. Once we have the article title, we now see that the next part is the title of the reference book. Well, if we go back to the first page of your packet, you notice that this is the title page of this reference book. What's the title of the reference book? There you go. Poetry for Students. So when you are typing, you are going to italicize this. It is impossible to italicize handwriting, so I can't do that here on the board. But you're going to italicize Poetry for Students and then put a period at the end of it. You notice that we follow capitalization rules. So for is not capitalized, but the other two words are. Next on our list is contributors. This is the person that we look at here and we go, who's the editor of this book? Here on the title page, it will show you the editor of this book. What is their name? Yes. So we're going to write after this, the contributor. We put their name, we put a comma, a space, and then we put ED to indicate that they are the editor of the book. Now, if they were the author of this entry, where would their name go? Where?
Underneath the title.
Here in our citation, where would it go?
Next to the title.
Which title? We got 2 titles. If they were the author of the entry, they would go here before Annabel Lee. So notice that if we know the formula, by looking here, we can tell what their job is and how they function. His name had shown up here, we would go, oh, he wrote the entry. But since it's here, we go, Okay, he contributed in some way and we designate that he's the editor. This is one of the easy ways that when you do research, teachers can start to dock points, is if you're not paying attention and doing these steps right, names show up in wrong places and suddenly they go, oh, gotcha. If we had more than one editor, we would list them here alphabetically, but since we just have one, that's all we need to do. Next, we see that it asks for the addition. Do you see any information about an addition number here on the title page? Let me help you here. There is none. You're not seeing it. So if you're going, oh, it must be there. No. But we always want to look. Hey, did they mark it? Nope. So we go to the next part. They ask for a volume number. Do you see a volume number? What volume are we looking at? Volume 9. So what I am going to do is to show you how this works. I'm going to skip to the next line and assume, hey, I'm out of room here. I go here. When we type entries on our works cited with our referencing, we include what's called a hanging indent. Now, most of the time, your processors, whether it's Google Docs or whatever, they're going to automatically do this for you. But it looks the opposite of creating a paragraph. This is going to sit on the left margin, and every other line of your citation is going to be bumped in a ½ inch. So if I was doing this, it would look like that. So once we have the editor, we want to indicate this is volume 9, so it would look VOL period space 9 period. Then we go to the next thing. It's looking for a city. If you look at the very bottom of your title page, companies will print here their name as a publication. This is Gale. Gale is a major research group. They publish lots of reference materials, especially for schools. Underneath that publisher, it lists cities that they have offices in. MLA format asks you to find the first city that's listed there. And if it's Gale, it is almost always, without fail, Detroit. So after we put VOL period space 9 period, we're going to put a space and put Detroit, and then a colon. And the next thing we need to list is our publisher, Gale. Oh, that's a comma. Then it's going to ask you for the year. If you flip your title page over, our publication page includes the copyright date, which is the year that this book was published. The year that's back here is what? 2000. Now, this is important to look for because what you need in a reference book like this is the most recent date. Let me give you an example. The Scarlet Letter was published in 1851. So if you open up and you look at that publication page in this book, you would notice that one of the dates that's going to show up here is 1851. But it's also going to give you the more recent year that this book I am holding in my hand was published. We need to always reference what is the year the book you are holding in your hand was published, which is the most recent year listed here. If you as student put down 1851 from when this went, I would call BS on your paper immediately because you are telling me that you are holding a first edition of the Scarlet Letter. And no one is going to let a grubby student touch a first edition of the Scarlet Letter. No one. So we want to make sure we have the correct date here. It's important we get this kind of information right for dates and stuff because your book may have a misprint, and rather than you getting the blame for it, you can be able to prove, no, it's the book, it's not me. Once we have that date, the last thing we put here is print. This indicates to the person that that's reading your paper, hey, I looked at the actual book, because when we do online sources, this looks different. And the way this sets up looks slightly different. So by indicating print, we're saying, hey, I saw this in print. This formats what our citation looks like. This would appear at the end of our paper on its own individual page as a works cited. But if you look at the back of the next page, we're going to talk about how we cite things that we pull out. Having this at the end of your paper is good and necessary, but we also need to be able to reference the specific facts and information you pull when you do research. This is a correlation. Again, the purpose of research is to show what you learned and to reference those facts and figures to show that I didn't know this, I pulled it from somewhere else. So when we use an actual fact, we have to put a citation at the end of that sentence that matches what we have here. That citation is going to start one of two ways. It is always going to be the first word of your works cited citation. This is either going to be the last name of the author that wrote the article or the book, or the first word of the entry. And here you see the first word is what? Let me help you. It's Annabelle. What is a page number that is in your packet?
13.
What?
13.
13. Let's say that you take a fact off of page 13 or a quote off of page 13. At the end of the sentence where you use that information, you're going to put in parentheses the first word here, Annabelle, and the page number, 13. It's really simple. So for number 4, this is your answer. What we are looking to avoid by doing all of these steps is plagiarism. Is it a familiar term to you? Plagiarism is talked about a lot at lower levels. It's mostly a gotcha. We start to talk about it more seriously as you get into upper level courses because we need to get you ready for college. Plagiarism is not disputed at a college level. I want to say that again. Plagiarism is not disputed or discussed at a college level. If you screw up and you don't put a citation on something, if you copy directly from a source and don't give credit, they don't play around in college. They will turn your paper over to a third party that investigates it. It usually means on the assignment you are going to get a 0. College classes only have 4 grades usually. So if you get a 0 on one of those 4 grades, what's your likelihood of passing that class? Yeah, it's a lot more serious. Now, why do they take it so serious at college? Those people get paid to produce research. Yes, they teach classes. Yes, they grade work. But part of their job in being at the university level is that they conduct and produce research that gets printed. They don't want somebody turning around and taking their work and not giving proper credit for it. And so, yeah, they take it really serious. We need to get you ready for that because it's not going to be one of those things where the teacher's going to go, hey, sweetie, come here. Can we sit down and talk about this? They don't reach out to you. They aren't going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They move on. So we need to make sure you know how to do these steps and do them correctly. So we're going to practice. Look at number 5. Number 5 is really straightforward. I want you to write one sentence that uses a fact or a quote about Poe's childhood. And at the end, properly cite it. This would mean that you list the correct page for where your fact or quote comes from. This is not that difficult, but I want you to practice doing this because this is where we're moving towards as we get into the latter parts of the week. So take a moment to write a single sentence that includes a fact or a quote about Poe's childhood and put a proper citation on it. Trying to do my best in class. My help is great. All right, I tried to move around, see what you had, see if I could offer some suggestions or input. Some of you were there, some of you weren't, but we're going to move on. Once we look at that last part of this assignment, it would have you look at the theme portion of this and start to see if you can talk about it. Now, that's not something we have to worry about today. I'm not concerned if it's not there. So more I'm concerned with, hey, can you do this? Can you do this? And can you put it together with a sentence? Where are we going with this? On Wednesday, there are 6 articles that we pulled over different poems. You're going to have a chance to choose one, and they're very different poems. You're going to choose one poem that you like. We're going to spend time with that. You're going to read the article from Poetry for Students for that poem and take notes one day. The next day, we're going to write about the poem just like we've done. Then we're going to fold in a piece of research to help to support what you're saying. So this is going to be a step-by-step process to get us there, and it's our first step into research. Tomorrow, we will be testing over the vocab. The test will reference 2 poems we have not read, and it will ask specific questions where you have to apply that vocabulary. That test grade will go on next 6 weeks. Well, is it next? think I'm going to put it on this 6 weeks. I got to double check. So make sure you're ready for tomorrow's test. Make sure you turn in today's work. If that's last question isn't done about theme, that's okay. I don't care. And that's for you too. If you don't do that last part about theme, it's okay. It'll let me see how many of you actually watch this. Anybody have questions? Okay. Make sure to get your work turned in.